Hey everyone, welcome to the Virtual Global Village podcast. I'm Salman, I'm BGV's architecture journalist, and today I'm joined by Tom from Outpost London. How are you doing, Tom?
Very well, very well.
So the way I came across your firm was I was looking for firms that are really focused on sustainability, bio-based materials, and just community in general. And your firm absolutely fit the bill. Just looking through your portfolio, I was like, yeah, these are the guys I've been looking for. So can you just talk about your firm's sort of values and goals and stuff with each project?
Yeah. So we're a small firm. We're about 4 to 6 people, depending on kind of projects. And probably 2 or 3 years ago, we really decided to change direction a bit from what we were doing, and really got very interested in different building approaches because we're very aware of the climate issues. I think you mentioned the word sustainability, and I think in all of our research, we sort of feel like we may have gone slightly beyond sustainability, really, in that we're going to have to, it's inevitable, regardless of what we do, there will be climate change. So actually, what we need to do is rethink what we do to be able to work with those changes that will happen, rather than saying, if we make these changes, we can continue to live as we did. And I think that's the principal mentality shift that we've had. And so, yeah, our goals are to build buildings that work with natural building materials, which I can kind of explain a bit more about maybe on
Oh,
specific
yeah.
areas.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. It all sounds great, and it's exactly why you're here. So the first project we'll move on to is Home 2030, which is, if I'm not mistaken, it's up for a government competition in 2030.
It was a government initiated competition organized by RIBA, or the government was partially involved, and it was basically looking for what the future housing in 2030 should look like, and how we should be building, with an aim of trying to get some sort of pilot projects set up now. And so we were shortlisted and were one of six to go into the final round and developed our design further. Um, and I think there were two other companies that won it, but we were sort of in the shortlisted. But it was a fascinating thing to look at a larger 300 home development and really start to think about um, more sustainable ways of living, which for us really had to do with land, the relationship to land and land management, food production, and communities, and how what we offered them. But yeah, I can, again, with probably easier against certain images, maybe to see what we mean. But yeah.
So you mentioned images. The first one we'll sort of point to is that huge vector file that we just brought up
Yeah.
before. So there's a lot of activity and various information being shown in this image, and you can really sort of pick out the public spaces from the private residential ones just from looking at that image as well. And I gotta say, I really appreciate how just all of this information is consistent between the visuals. It was really satisfying to look at through the images that you sent. I was just wondering what the sort of precedence for the entire concept was, and what was the process before you arrived at this huge, like, a vector file.
So I think there are a number of things at play. The site was actually on the edge of an existing city, and I think we really feel that we wanted to create clusters of communities. So we felt, for example, in an architecture office or any office, there's a sort of maximum number of people that seem to be able to cooperate with each other in a small group, and beyond that, you start needing new structures. So what we looked at is the idea of forming sort of cluster houses that might be somewhere between, 3, 4 houses, all the way up to, say, 12 to 16 houses, that all clustered together, and they form a community. And within that cluster of housing, there's always a shared ownership element to that design, whether it's a greenhouse, a shed, open space, courtyard, something that basically binds that community together. And then those clusters all were to sit together, and then around other public shared spaces that all the other communities could come to as well, so that in a sense you weren't trying to create one giant utopian sort of, we're all together, everyone can have their little space, and within that there's communities and they all work out together. I think we worked with an amazing landscape designer, Propagating Dan, and for us the integration of nature and landscape with housing in the city is really kind of a key thing. I think it's clear that we're going to have to improve our food security and food production. The UK is not self-sufficient. If you suddenly have food cut off, you run out quite quickly, and I think that ability to be able to engage with the landscape has, numerous other benefits, mental health. We all had it in lockdown. We all loved going into gardens if we were lucky enough to have one.
Absolutely, yeah.
Community cohesion, but also kind of really that biodiversity, because it's not obviously just the climate change issue that everyone's talking about, also the biodiversity issues with real loss of species. And I think our idea is maximalist. We really want to absolutely maximize what's happening in those areas and how we do that. And to do that, we had to minimalize the car. So the car is basically really written out in quite a large way. It is possible, basically it's designed in a way that we can conform to all of the fire rules with how far the fire engine needs to be off a road, and there are roads that go through, but the whole sort of parking on road and traditional use of road was more marginalized, and we looked at big car barns that sat on the side of the site where all the cars could park and charge under one big PV area. I mean, we really foresee the car sharing as being probably the way forward, giving the costs. A car, for example, let's say an EV, if it's got, say, 20 tons of carbon, if everyone in the world has one, well, you've got a problem, because
Yeah.
we're meant to be, bringing it to net zero by somewhere between 2030 and 2050, and that task is really quite extraordinary. So I think we've looked at it on that wide city scale, and then we've also looked at it in the sort of more intimate scale of that cluster, and then also even smaller scale of how the building is built and what materials and so on.
Yeah, it sounds very intricate and ambitious overall as well. It sounds like you really made an infrastructure of communities within this project. And the community is, it's a huge focus on a lot of your projects looking through your portfolio. I was wondering, so when you are given a project and community is one of the things you want to enhance and enrich, is there an approach you found works with every single one? Like, is there a consistent approach to tackling that problem?
Probably not, but I mean, I guess we do believe a little bit in, let's say, getting your hands dirty and being a bit messy, because I don't believe that we can deliver what we need by waiting for others to deliver it for us. I think we need to basically take charge of our communities, and just say, right, okay, this is my street, and what can we do, and somehow get together. And it is a really difficult thing to actually corral many people and make something happen, and get everyone to agree or whatever. But uh, in a way, I think our Bale office building is a sort of prime example of really what got us excited and what we love about architecture. So we said, we need an office space for our meetings. Our small main building is kind of, we've outgrown it. So he said, right, let's build it, and let's build it ourselves. Let's not ask some contractor to come in and build it. So then that's how we kind of really got into the world of straw and clays and hemps and all these, timber. So we just went for it and built it ourselves. Never built one before. We did all the research. We learned about it. We got people who'd done it before to come and train us as a training course, and we did it as a whole office, and we built it. And I think it's extremely powerful and empowering, because people get enthused and realize what they can do for themselves. And I really do think that's at the heart of how we're going to address the issues that we face.
Yeah, no, that's all great. It's really like powerful, all these themes about community and sort of rising up and taking control of your own space. Because I feel like in this pandemic, speaking from personal experience, I'm definitely more appreciative of like the spaces that are around me. Whereas before I didn't really pay that much attention to them, but now I'm like, oh, hey, there's a cafe in this corner. I never knew that. That
Yes.
kind of stuff. So I think people are, gaining more awareness of what's around them, definitely, especially
Def
after everything that's happened.
yeah.
So sustainability is obviously it's a huge focus at VGB. It's a huge focus at Outpost as well. So wondering, with a huge project like this, a huge housing project, what was the biggest challenge you had to tackle when it comes to sustainability? What was the biggest problem that you had to face?
The biggest problem that we have actually at the moment is legislative and bureaucracy of existing sort of, let's say, structures or power structures. So, you know, for example, if I were to list the benefits, for example, of building in natural building materials in a very quick kind of way, for example, in our 2030 homes, we were storing a huge amount of carbon by using straw. We had completely, open vapor open houses that had really great indoor air quality. We had zero waste at end of life. You could literally compost the building into the ground. You have huge high performance, passive house level of performance. You have available materials that are currently grown in the UK. You don't have to set up new supply chains or anything. You have something that is easy to work with if you know how to do it, and so could represent great training opportunities. You have all these, the benefits just go on and on and on, and you can list them, and then you get to the like, yes, but that product's not BBA certified, and for that company to do it is going to cost 10 grand a year every year. And so, or the developer says, well, I'm not sure the risk, or because no one knows it, they don't know it as much. They just think, oh, we know bricks, we know PIR insulation, we know block work, we know we can improve the thermal, so let's just keep using that. But the fact is that if you build a passive house with standard, block work and PIR insulation, everything, you're using about 50 tons of carbon to build the building and about 50 tons over its lifetime in energy use. If you do a natural building using primarily bio-based materials, you are sequestering 35 tons of carbon and you're using 50 tons to heat it. So therefore it goes from 15 tons to 100 tons. And that's the difference in carbon between those two things. So it should be a no-brainer. But the fact
Yeah,
is that the insurance market is not very happy about anything that's not brick and block and PIR, even though it burns like crazy. The developers don't fully understand it. The mortgage market doesn't have much that tailors for that. So really it's at that legislative upper level where only really government can come in and make a big difference. If they were to create an insurance scheme or a mortgage scheme, or force companies to have to hit certain targets, it would change very rapidly. And I suspect it might happen over the coming years, but it's still really at an early stage in that side of things.
that leads into the next question nicely because like you mentioned, just bureaucracy and government bills could really help push this forward because that's a common complaint with architects where they want to push the boundaries, they want to
Yeah.
continue the evolution of architecture, but then the client or is insurance companies are like, no, keep it simple, keep it cheap, keep it functional.
Yeah.
So in New York, San Francisco, Singapore, they have a bill that makes it mandatory for any new building or any building going under renovation to have a sort of green infrastructure that they should invest in. So that could be green roofs or solar panels on the roofs and stuff. And that's like a good first step. It isn't like the end of the problem. It's just a good first step,
Yeah.
would you say?
I,
Yeah.
I would be critical of that because I think the issue is well, you have to think of it that a lot of this is sort of can be industry led, and the idea of a lot of these things can be to sell more stuff. And there is absolutely no point in taking an existing house that was built in the 1980s and spending £20,000 on a solar array system on its roof to improve it. That's a total waste of money by comparison to spending the same £20,000 insulating it with natural wood fiber. Because in the UK, for example, to put a solar thing on is about 7 years payback or thereabouts in carbon. So it takes 7 years for it to even pay back the carbon it's emitted.
Jeez.
And then there's another, so then you get, roughly 13 years of benefit out of it. But you still have a building that's basically having to be fired by a gas, heated by a gas boiler because it's so inefficient. So the mantra that in the industry is it's called fabric first. So basically, we should all be investing in the fabric of the building, which is exactly what we're doing with, big, thick straw walls or insulation. So we should be looking to insulate externally, or if that's not possible for heritage reasons, insulating internally to a very high level. And that will be the most, let's say, that will assist in the removal of gas boilers from houses the best, because you can't actually take an existing 1980s house and put an air source heat pump on it and make it really work well, because they just don't produce as much heat. And it's much more efficient to insulate that first and then put the heat pump on it.
Yeah, I've sort of heard the opposite side to, because you were very critical of this bill, just and you made a very very good point that this money could be going into more efficient places and not spent on solar panels. They seem like a very basic way to sort of tackle this problem.
I think the technology is amazing, and I think we have to use it and employ it. Don't get me wrong. I totally
Yeah,
support the use of, well, if we don't replace fossil fuels with a new energy, then I guess we go back to a very different time indeed. But
yeah,
so
definitely.
so so it's necessary, and I totally support it. What I'm saying though is that if it has to be a combination of efficiencies first, then the technologies to support that. Because if you just want to use the same amount of energy as we do now, I think someone did a calculation of the kind of area of solar panel that you would need in Germany. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was a huge portion of that land mass, to produce all the energy. Whereas if you were to reduce your energy demand by a tenth, which is effectively what, to a tenth, so basically passive house, it uses about a tenth of a conventional building regs modern house, roughly. Therefore, you need 10 times less solar panels, and it's much easier to do. So the wastefulness is the thing that needs to be addressed at the same time.
Yeah, I think this is a good lead-in into the straw bale meeting room, which is one of your most fascinating projects, because you've described it as an experiment, sort of test bed for these materials.
Yeah.
So could you just talk us through how this idea came about? I think you mentioned you just wanted a new meeting space, was it?
Yeah, we have a great studio space in this sort of slightly creative courtyard area, and there was a space that became available that had a caravan on it before, so we've leased that space and built our own building on it. But I think really we'd been exploring already, so we've been to a straw bale convention, various training courses, various places, and we're interested in this. And we just thought this is a great opportunity to try it. The building is by no means an exemplar of energy efficiency or anything. It's a hybrid of many bits and attempts. But I think for us, it was mostly about doing it and learning the process. So, how do you stack straw bale on top of each other and make it work? How do you lime render onto straw? How do you build it all? And I think what's kind of really fascinating is that there's so many different ways in which you can do it, and you do have to kind of do it to understand the pros and cons. So for example, you need a massive roof overhang with a straw building to try and get the water away from everything. So you won't be doing modernist, sleek kind of, edge details where there's no overhang. Your roof is going to be doing this, and it fundamentally changes the vernacular of your architecture. What details you have to do based on the materials. So I think there's a sort of opportunity there to explore something new as well, from a kind of aesthetics perspective. But yeah.
You mentioned sort of bio-based materials and the straw bale having mental health benefits and just general well-being benefits. Could you elaborate further on those?
Yes. So I think the main difference, well, for a kind of health and well-being perspective, modern buildings are built of materials that, generally speaking, don't allow moisture to travel through the wall, in and out of the wall. So if you have a plasterboard and blockwork or something, the moisture effectively gets stuck at a certain point and can't get out. So if you were to completely seal that room like a plastic bag, that moisture would build up, and actually human breath is, just living has a lot of moisture, a bath, cooking, everything. And that would get trapped in the walls and basically create mold and unhealthy air. Which is why we then ventilate. So we have mechanical ventilation, or we have windows that we open that then make the building less efficient. And so the advantage of certain bio-based materials and the way in which you construct them is that they are naturally hygroscopic, which basically means that they can absorb moisture, hold it, and then give it back to the internal environment if it starts getting too dry, or pass it to the external environment, whichever side is effectively the drier. So it naturally creates an equilibrium between those. So there's a misunderstanding, though. It's not that the building is breathing, it's airtight. So you can build in such a way that the air isn't leaving the building, but the moisture can pass through it. And that has huge benefits. You probably, I think there's a study that says we can reduce ventilation in a natural building by about 9 times. So that reduces the amount of mechanical plant we need. The other things, of course, is that there's no toxins. So a straw bale is literally what's just pretty much come off the field. There's nothing in it. They have a natural silica in it which prevents it from going moldy or rotting. That's just in its nature. But a lot of modern building materials, from MDF, have formaldehyde in it, or there's lots of glues and additives and things that aren't actually very healthy for you. And in the past, that hasn't been as much of an issue because our buildings have leaked so much air that those vapors basically are leaving the building. We are now getting into an environment where, even by normal building regs, it's becoming more airtight, and therefore those vapors and off-gassing from your insulation, which might off-gas, your paints, which are basically petroleum sort of based products, they all give off things that are known to harm us, and natural building materials don't, so they kind of avoid that. And also on top of that, the sort of no waste at end of life sort of issues in terms of having things that are toxic that end up in landfills and pollute our water. So we really have to think about that side of it too. So those are the kind of key benefits. There's many others, but
Well, that all sounds fascinating. So you talked about how it was an experiment. I was wondering, the things you learned from it, how did you go on to apply them to your other projects?
I think it teaches you, when you design, to be a bit more tolerant, and there's a kind of I guess something about CAD as well that makes you draw everything to kind of 1 millimeter, and that aligns with that, and that corner is 100% 90 degrees, and that mentality, the sort of boxes everywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
If you're doing a traditional straw bale build, it's quite difficult to be that accurate, because the bales might vary by 10 or 20 mil, and you have to, and actually that flexibility, you realize, is actually quite useful. You can adapt and change, so that there's a lot more interaction on site, where you're just slightly changing things from the drawing. It's not like a sort of CNC cut thing that just suddenly appears and it's exactly like the drawing. And then I think as well, the fact that the natural building materials are quite easy to work with, so you don't have to be massively kind of skilled to work with them. Obviously, working with them, you can have very skilled lime plasterers but equally I can do it. So and I think that's enjoyable, but also you can then decide to just slightly change things on site, round it off a bit more, because you're working with your hands. So it's this sort of simplicity of things that I think is really beautiful.
That's a great take on it. I've heard so David Sheffield opened a new skyscraper in New York recently, and a lot of critics were saying it's unremarkable. It doesn't really stand out with the other skyscrapers it's with. and his response was, "Not every building you make has to be something revolutionary. It doesn't have to, look like something from Mars." And I think that's especially with the Twickenham project, where you've sort of used materials from around the site, which is a very vernacular approach. You've sort of made a space that stands out, but it doesn't feel out of place. It stands out within the space it's in,
Yes.
and yeah, that's very commendable, I gotta say. But yeah, there's a lot of critics
Well,
who constantly ask for revolutionary architecture.
well, I guess, to your question of how you approach this each project, which you were asking around community, I guess that the answer actually to that is that we don't really start with what the building should look like or form or anything. We do, on Twickenham, we looked at it and said, look, here's this site. It runs from the busy high street down to the Thames. It's next to sort of quite a cute little high street that goes down the back, very old buildings. But there's a sort of dead spot between, and we wanted to link those two, the riverfront and the main high street. But we wanted to do that in a way that was basically just full of activity and a bit messy. We wanted studio spaces, we wanted a market, we wanted, open covered space that, events might take place. And so it was we basically work through the brief of what it is that we're trying to facilitate, I guess, as a building. And then once we've done that, the building form starts to take its shape. And of course, then, yes, we respond to the building next door and, how it's shading the neighbors and how it feels as a volume. And we act then in the sort of in the aesthetic way as well. But it has to start for us from kind of what we're trying to deliver to that community. And generally speaking, I guess the more open it is to allowing people to engage and use it in the way that they may see fit, I think the more interested in it we are as well.
Yeah, there's like an aspect of urban regeneration in that proposal. You talk a lot about how you aim to activate the site, really sort of revitalize it. And I think, we mentioned before how we're sort of growing more appreciative of our urban spaces because,
Mhm.
we haven't been around them in a long time. I feel like a sort of urban regeneration is happening there as well, where a lot of people are more taking notice of just the space around them. Like, there's just here in Manchester, just in the city centre, there's just a lot of listed buildings and private buildings that are just not used at all. They're just, huge buildings completely abandoned that could be, repurposed to be accommodation or just, big open public buildings for people.
I think we're going to see a lot of that. I think it's kind of on vogue and within the thinking of both developers and architects. So the reuse of post-COVID, office buildings that might not be used anymore, whatever. And I think there could be an interesting sort of approach where it hopefully won't all just get turned into like private housing units in some massive office floor, and you might suddenly find that there's a big market in a tower building that used to be an office with a vertical farm growing in it or something. That I think again it's kind of like that maximalist approach on the 2030 project where we said, how many variations of different plants and nature can we get into this small space? I think the city is the same. We can say, well, how many different types of activities can we get? I think there's been far too much pushing of all the different activities to the extremity of the city. Smithfield, yeah, let's put that on the outside. We want to have, more and more restaurants so I think all those activities, or Twickenham even, Twickenham was, I think our work was sort of mostly inspired by how active that dock front was originally. They were building all sorts of boats and there were people everywhere and all sorts of activities. And that was made possible by the fact that there were these sort of, warehouse type buildings, big spaces that could accommodate all sorts of things. And I think a lot of buildings have become, it's all an internal space. It all has to be super insulated, and it's all, or it's a shop, and here's the glass line, and that's public and that's private. I really think that we do need the range of different types of spaces. We need the super insulated, super tight, very kind of like private spaces. We need spaces that are just big pitched roofs that you can go and do stuff under. You'd need so the whole city can kind of live and breathe in accordance to some of the seasons. Maybe in the summer everyone's out and there's spaces that are not so used in the winter, that all sorts of fun things are happening. And then in the winter, why not everything slightly retreat back again and be a bit more indoor and a bit more and use less energy. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, it's a very exciting, just the prospect of sort of urban revival, and just just the excitement you get of just exploring a new urban space is just fantastic as well. And before we run out of time, I do want to talk about the Vinery, which is a restoration project I think you guys are doing.
Well, sort of. Yeah, this is a sort of slightly unusual project it's in South Hams, Devon. It was an existing Nissen hut, so it's a basically curved agricultural building. So what we're doing there is we're actually basically rebuilding the same Nissen hut building shape, but we're doing it in a straw bale vault, with a timber frame straw bale vault, and this is going to be a sort of private domestic house. But it will be, what we're trying to do is achieve passive house with these natural building materials on a slightly unusual form and shape, and create something that will be really just quite an interesting space to be in. And we wanted to keep the original form because it has such a kind of low profile in the landscape. It somehow, we looked at having a sort of traditional pitched roof with straight sides, and it just really popped up much higher. And there was something kind of really elegant about the fact that the roof is also the wall, and it's just this one very simple section. Of course, it's kind of not that simple because it's curved, so it makes
Yeah.
everything harder. But yeah, we're really excited about that one, and that'll be hopefully in time as well. Sort of it will be connected to the grid, but it will have its own solar, and it's also on a borehole, and it's going to have rainwater harvesting, and it's going to be completely natural building sort of material. So there'll be sort of a limecrete floor, GSL compacted glass foam, insulation and capillary break below that instead of concrete. Advantages on things like that are like, you can, at the end of the life, if you were to say get rid of that building in 200 years time, that granular insulation that you use, you could literally uncompact it, take it away and use it on another site, because all it is just granules that get compacted. And so it's that mentality of saying, well, what am I leaving for others in the future? Am I leaving a massive load of toxic waste buried below concrete, or am I leaving something that someone else can just easily take away and reuse?
I gotta ask, where exactly is it? Because it's a very sort of obscure and niche project. How did it come? How did it come to you as well?
That one is actually a personal project, so that one is for me. And
Okay, wow.
it's in the countryside. It's in an area of sort of outstanding natural beauty, so it's quite. We used something called a Class Q planning policy to obtain permission to change an agricultural building into a domestic building.
So what's the first sort of practical step to that after all the process work? So how much of like the original structure will you keep? How much will you change?
We will actually replace it all, because there's nothing there other than this much metal, like which is more or less rust, and then there's a sort of bit of steel structure as well. So there's very little to it. It's less to do with the renovation. It's more a new build of the same thing. I think for us, we're interested in both the city as a place that needs to bring nature and the sort of variation back in, but equally I think we're interested in land policy and planning policy in the countryside. So we've kind of looked at that a bit with our Lakes and Dales project as well, which we feel that there's a kind of very old-fashioned view of the countryside, that it needs to be kept free of people, free of biodiversity, big green fields with nothing in it, which basically is kind of like a sort of dead zone of just grass. And actually we believe that we need to bring people back to the country and have lots of small communities that work in the landscape, with permaculture, food growing or whatever, and actually increase and improve the biodiversity lot of our landscapes in the UK, and also then our food production. So I think our kind of thinking around living in the countryside and what it means, I think would be really interesting to look at. The One Planet Living policy in Wales was quite interesting, and we're working with a team of people who are implementing the successor to One Planet Living and are attempting to get that ratified in various councils, like somewhere in Cornwall and Devon, which would then allow people to build very sustainable communities that are tied to the land use and what they produce. And I think that could be really beneficial for a lot of people, so that we don't just all abandon the countryside and all end up in a very, very dense city, and share it out across.
Yeah, we don't want to end up like Los Angeles and Blade Runner, that's for sure. So just before we wrap up, any sort of final thoughts on sustainability and architecture, and what's next for Outpost London? What are you guys up to right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess working on our project, the Nissen Hut, is one of the main things, because we want to see what we can do with that. We are working across a range of different projects, so I think, yeah, we really want to push more into the getting new buildings built in this kind of construction methodology, but as well working, as I said, with other people. I think the success of our response will be kind of not what you do as an individual firm, but who you're working with and what community and groups you're part of, because it is quite a big task. Every time I sit on the train, at the moment I'm based outside of London in Surrey, and commute into our office in Waterloo occasionally, and you just go past miles and miles and miles and miles of houses, and you're just going, every one of those houses needs to have its gas boiler removed, and it needs to be insulated, and you do just think there's a lot of work to do here, and how are we going to do that? So I think innovative approaches to kind of how we live will be really important. So like, maybe not everyone will be able to afford to do up their whole house to a passive house standard. Are there other ways of thinking about how we do it? Do we, a bit like on the city scale, do we concentrate money on one part of the house that becomes the winter part, and then the other part is the sort of spring and summer part, because it's actually not that cold most of the time in England at the moment? Are there different ways of treating it so that we can kind of achieve those energy levels? There's going to be so many interesting things that come out over the next 15 to 20 years, I would hope.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great thought to leave on. So I want to thank Tom from Outpost London for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's been a great chat. Nice talking to you. I want to thank Katie from Bowerbird as well for linking us up. And Francesca, thanks for recording this. If you're watching this on YouTube, please do check out the links in the description. Follow VGV on Instagram, and visit our website, and check out Outpost London on Instagram and their website as well, just looking through their portfolio of projects. It was really fun. There's some great visual stuff in there, which I'm sure we will edit in as well.
Fantastic.
So yeah, thank you all for watching.
Thank you.